The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone as Sarah Chen clocked in at 11:44 p.m., 3 minutes before her shift officially began. Sacred Heart's emergency department sprawled across the 3rd floor like a living organism, its vital signs visible on monitors, its breath in the steady wheeze of ventilators, its heartbeat in the endless beep of alarms that had become background music to her 12 years on night shift. The antiseptic smell hit her first, always, that chemical pine scent that never quite masked the copper underneath, blood, old and new, oxidized into the building's walls like a permanent stain. She moved through the corridor with movements that seemed almost rehearsed, efficient enough to be unremarkable. That was the point. Stay invisible. Do the work. Don't draw attention. Her shift bag, worn leather from 2003, went into her locker along with her street clothes. The scrub she pulled on had no wrinkles because she'd ironed them flat the night before, the edges knife-sharp. Muscle memory, though she never thought of it that way anymore. Sarah's hands moved across the unit board, checking assignments. Trauma Bay 2 prepped for incoming. Surgical Bay 1 stable, post-operative. Recovery Room 3 occupied by a patient 3 hours into post-anesthesia. Everything catalogued, sequenced, ordered the way she'd been trained to order chaos. Her hands were steady now, though they'd trembled that morning when she'd held her coffee cup, old habit, the tremor that came when the body remembered things the mind tried to forget. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived for morning rounds at 6:15 a.m., moving through the hospital corridors like a man who owned them. He was 43, impeccably dressed in a tailored white coat over a shirt that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, his tie a shade of blue that suggested a prep school somewhere in his background. He carried a tablet instead of paper charts, and his voice had the particular resonance of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Chief of Emergency Medicine for 4 months now, promoted from County General where he'd spent 8 years building a reputation for decisive action and zero tolerance for protocol deviation. He didn't notice Sarah at first. Why would he? She was just the night shift nurse in her late 40s, moving between beds with quiet competence, adjusting for flow rates, documenting vitals, the kind of worker that hospitals ran on but no one particularly saw. He noticed her the second time around, when he was checking on a 34-year-old trauma patient admitted at 2 a.m. with a stab wound to the abdomen, now stable but requiring careful observation. Sarah was checking the patient's vitals, and Ashford paused mid-stride, his eyes narrowing. Her hands moved across the patient's abdomen with systematic precision that was wrong somehow, wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. She wasn't feeling for obvious bleeding or distension the way a nurse would. She was assessing something deeper, her fingers moving in a pattern that suggested she was reading information most people couldn't access, her touch light as a surgeon's would be, checking for subtle signs of compartment syndrome, evaluating peritoneal tension, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly when she found something that confirmed some internal calculation. "How long in post-op?" she asked the patient, her voice low, the tone of someone gathering data. 2 hours, the patient said. "I feel fine." "Well, everything hurts, but that's normal." Sarah's voice didn't rise or fall. "But we're going to keep you quiet. If anything changes, you tell someone immediately." Dizziness. Nausea. Shortness of breath. Anything. Ashford watched her chart the notes, watched the way she entered vital signs into the system with movements that suggested she understood what the numbers meant in a context beyond the immediate moment. Pain was information, she'd heard that phrase once, years ago, in a context that made her skin crawl. Her hands went still as soon as she stepped away from the bedside, that tremor returning the instant she wasn't actively working. He made a note on his tablet. Something about that nurse. Something off. Something that didn't fit the profile. The medevac alert came at 7:33 a.m., a calm voice on the overhead speaker that made everyone in the ED move faster without thinking about it. Trauma alert. Incoming critical. ETA 6 minutes. Navy SEAL training accident, respiratory compromise, head trauma, potential thoracic injury. Trauma Bay 1 prepped and ready. Sarah's entire body went still. It wasn't the kind of stillness that anyone would have noticed if they weren't already watching her carefully. Her hands, which had been moving toward the supply cart, simply stopped mid-motion. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't change. But something in her body, some essential frequency that had been running beneath the surface, just halted, like a transmission shifting into neutral. "Chen," Ashford called out, already moving toward Trauma Bay 1. "Your lead nurse on this one. Let's move." "Yes, doctor," she said, and her voice was exactly as it had always been. Deferential. Calm. Invisible. The helicopter blades made the windows rattle before the actual aircraft appeared above the parking lot, the distinctive thud-thud-thud of a Black Hawk's rotor wash that moved the air pressure in the entire building. Sarah moved to Trauma Bay 1 and began pulling supplies with the muscle memory of someone who'd prepared for critical arrivals under combat conditions. Pressure dressings. For lines. Suction equipment. The stretcher rolled in 17 seconds later, paramedics calling out vitals in the practiced staccato of people who'd been doing this for years. "Good work, Chen," Ashford said, barely looking at her. "Now step back. Let me handle the critical assessment." She stepped back. That was what invisibility required. You did the work, and then you disappeared again. Let someone else take credit, let someone else make the decisions. That was the deal she'd made 7 years ago when the Navy had offered her a choice: stay quiet and live, or talk and disappear in ways that the government preferred not to discuss. The X-ray technician arrived 60 seconds later, mobile unit in hand, and Sarah watched the image appear on the monitor. Pneumothorax. Growing. Tracheal deviation beginning. Reeves was going into tension pneumothorax, which meant his lung was collapsing and his heart was next, which meant they had maybe 3 minutes before he coded. "We need to decompress," Sarah said quietly. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now." Ashford's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with something that looked like anger, though the predominant emotion seemed to be indignation at the interruption. "I'm the attending physician here, Chen. I'll make the clinical decisions. You handle nursing duties." "The trachea's deviating," Sarah said, and her voice had dropped a tone, become something other than deferential. "He's losing oxygenation. We do the needle decompression right now or he codes in 90 seconds. Are you questioning my clinical judgment?" "I'm stating clinical fact." The monitor beeped. Heart rate 168. O2 sat 68 and dropping. Reeves's eyes were starting to show the glassy quality of severe hypoxia. Ashford reached for the needle kit, his movements suddenly faster, suddenly less certain than they'd been a moment before. Sarah already had the equipment ready: 14-gauge angiocath, alcohol prep, everything laid out in the exact sequence he would need. She'd learned that skill in a place where the difference between prepared and unprepared meant body bags. The needle went in at an angle, and suddenly there was a hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, the beautiful, terrible sound of a pneumothorax decompressing. The monitor's numbers shifted almost immediately. Heart rate dropping. O2 sat climbing. 72, 78. 84, sinus rhythm steadying. "Get me 2 more units," Ashford ordered, already moving toward the next step, already recovering his authority. "And prepare for chest tube insertion. This man needs immediate surgical intervention." Sarah was already moving, already calling down to blood bank, already preparing the surgical suite, her hands moving through a sequence that lived in her muscle memory from a time and place she wasn't allowed to talk about. But her mind was 3 steps ahead of everything. She could see the problem that would develop if they didn't address the cardiac contusion that was almost certainly coming, could see the complications that would require someone who understood trauma surgery at a level that went beyond the textbook. That was when Ashford's eyes met hers, and for just a moment, something in his expression shifted. He'd seen her hands move with that precision. He'd watched her anticipate the crisis. He'd noticed that she knew things that a standard ER nurse shouldn't know. "Chen," he said, his voice taking on a different tone now, something colder. "Step outside for a moment." She followed him into the corridor, and her heart was already accelerating because she recognized that tone, recognized the expression. She'd seen it before, years ago, in a colonel's office in Ramadi when they'd explained that her service record was being reclassified, that certain missions would no longer exist in any database, that she would need to find a new life in which nobody knew who she'd been. "Where did you train?" Ashford asked without preamble. "And don't tell me it was just nursing school." "I'm a registered nurse with 12 years emergency department experience," Sarah said, her voice settling into the careful neutral space she'd perfected over years of invisibility. "My apologies if I overstepped." "That's not what I asked you." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the patient room behind them. Wheeze hiss, the mechanical breath of someone whose lungs couldn't manage the work alone. "You need to stay in your lane, Chen," Ashford said, and his voice had taken on the edge of something approaching contempt. "You're a nurse. You're not a doctor. You don't make clinical calls. You follow my orders. You understand?" "Yes, doctor," Sarah said, and she meant it in exactly the way it sounded, a surface yes that covered a much deeper knowledge of how hospitals worked, how authority functioned, how people like Ashford maintained their position by ensuring that people like her remained invisible. "Good. Now get back in there and assist with the chest tube." "And Chen? Don't do that again. Next time you question my judgment in front of a patient, I'm writing you up." She returned to the trauma bay without responding, and Ashford went back to being the chief of emergency medicine, the man in charge, the final authority. In the bed, Lieutenant Commander James Reeves was stabilizing, his vitals climbing toward something approaching normal. He hadn't opened his eyes yet, didn't know that Sarah was there, didn't know that the woman who'd been his subordinate 7 years ago, the one he'd sacrificed to cover up a mission that had gone wrong, was the one who'd just saved his life. The reprimand appeared on the unit board at 6:47 in the morning, printed in that clinical sans serif font that made cruelty look administrative. "Nurse Chen, unauthorized advanced procedures documented on seal patient. See me immediately." Sarah read it once, then walked past without slowing her pace, her badge clipped to a lanyard that had frayed at the edges from 12 years of night shifts. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that pale institutional glow, and she could feel the weight of it already, the way people's eyes tracked her movements, the way conversation stopped mid-sentence when she rounded a corner. By 7:30, Ashford had positioned himself at the nurse's station like a general preparing a public execution. He stood with his shoulders back, his posture that specific kind of rigid that only came from someone who'd spent his entire life climbing hierarchies and pushing people down. Sarah approached, and that's when she saw them, Reeves's wife standing beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear, and his 12-year-old daughter in a jacket too large for her frame, looking at Sarah with the particular intensity of a child trying to understand adult hostility. "Mrs. Reeves," Ashford said, his voice pitched to carry across the entire unit, "I apologize that our night nurse took liberties with your husband's care. Some staff forget their place in the chain of command." He didn't look at Sarah. That was the cruelty of it. He was performing for an audience, and she was the prop. "You're a nurse, Chen, not a surgeon. Your little Florence Nightingale routine might impress the aides, but I see through it. This kind of boundary violation is exactly how mistakes become complications, become lawsuits." Sarah's jaw tightened. She could see the worry deepen in Mrs. Reeves's expression, watch the daughter's small hand grip her mother's sleeve tighter. The room had gone quiet in that particular way, not peaceful, but tensioned, like the air pressure before a storm. She took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them, indifferent and eternal. A single tear escaped. Sarah wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. "I've been dishonorably discharged by better men than you, Doctor." It didn't stick then either. The words landed like a detonation. Ashford's face flushed scarlet, the color creeping up his neck in real time, his mouth opening and closing. Sarah didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to the medication room, her movements precise and controlled, every step a masterclass in dignity under fire. But inside her chest, her heart was hammering like she was back in Ramadi, like rounds were incoming, like survival required this exact kind of composure, the kind that came from having already lost everything and walking away with nothing but the knowledge that she'd done what was right. Over the next 2 days, Ashford's campaign shifted from public humiliation into something more systematic, more calculated. He reassigned her to the worst shifts, the graveyard hour from 2 to 10 in the morning when staffing was skeleton crew and the ward's problems compounded. He restricted her access to the ICU, requiring her to request Ashford's explicit permission for any patient interaction, a power play dressed up as protocol compliance. He made calls to board members that Sarah would later learn about through the hospital grapevine, carefully worded concerns about her independent streak and her difficulty respecting institutional hierarchy. The break room became a study in social exclusion. Staff would scatter when she entered, gathering their lukewarm coffee and half-eaten salads, filing out in ones and twos until she sat alone at a corner table, surrounded by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of someone's reheated seafood from yesterday. A surgical resident started calling her Nightingale in rounds, pronouncing it with mocking emphasis, drawing out the syllables like she was something theatrical and fake. Others picked it up. Has Nightingale seen the post-op labs? Someone page Nightingale. Each repetition was a small blade, precise and calculated. Ashford watched it happen and never said a word, which meant he approved. Sarah had survived worse. She'd survived sand in places she didn't know sand could reach, survived watching people die in doorways and stairwells, survived the court-martial that had ended one life and forced her into this half-existence where she had to be invisible to be safe. She could survive this too. The burn in her chest wasn't anger, it was control, the tight management of rage that would only destroy her if she let it escape. But that wasn't the worst part. On the second night of the reassignments, Sarah was checking the supply inventory in the medication room when the power flickered. Just once. A single blink of darkness followed by the return of fluorescent light. She didn't think much of it. Storms were common in Raleigh in spring, rolling in from the mountains like artillery, sudden and absolute. She continued counting vials of midazolam, entering numbers into the electronic log with careful precision. Then the weather alert system at the nurse's station activated, not the usual chime, but the full emergency alert, the one that meant something catastrophic. Sarah moved toward the sound without thinking, her body responding to that particular tone the way a soldier responds to sirens. The alert displayed across the screen in stark red text, flash flood warning. Dam failure upstream. Evacuate low-lying areas immediately. The hospital's backup systems hadn't been tested in 14 months. That was a detail Sarah learned later. At the time, she only knew that the second-floor intercom crackled with instructions to secure all patients in upper wing rooms, that the basement, 3 levels down, was already beginning to flood, that 17 patients currently on the lower surgical wing, including a Navy SEAL whose heart she'd held steady less than 48 hours ago, were about to be trapped in rising water with no evacuation route and no power to operate the emergency generators. She was moving toward the stairwell when Ashford appeared in the corridor like he'd materialized from the wall itself. His hand closed around her arm with surprising strength, fingers digging into the fabric of her scrub jacket. The lower floors are a loss, Chen. His voice was steady, clinical, the voice of someone making hard decisions for the greater good. I'm reassigning all available staff to secure the upper wings. That's an order. Sarah looked at his hand gripping her arm. Then she looked at his face, at the way his eyes had already moved past her toward the administrative wing and the phone call he needed to make. She didn't pull away immediately. 17 patients, doctor. Who you are not authorized to treat without direct supervision. His grip tightened. If you go down there and touch anyone without explicit clearance, I will have your license revoked before the sun comes up. Do you understand me? Your career ends. Sarah pulled free in one fluid motion. She didn't use force, just shifted her weight and let physics do the work, the way someone who'd spent years in controlled environments learned to move. Ashford grabbed air. I need some jello, she said quietly, and walked toward the stairwell before he could respond. Behind her, she heard him on his phone, his voice dropping into that smooth administrative cadence. Yes, Board Chair Williams, I've made the call to prioritize savable patients. It's unfortunate but necessary, but we have to think about institutional liability. The lower wing represents a total loss in terms of, his voice faded as Sarah descended. The stairs were already damp when she reached them. Water was seeping under the door from the basement level, a thin grey line that looked almost harmless. Sarah pushed through and found darkness, the kind of absolute black that existed before the invention of electricity. She pulled her phone from her pocket and activated the flashlight, its beam cutting through water that was already rising past her knees, cold and carrying the sharp mineral smell of floodwater, that particular scent of mud and rocks and things that had been underground for decades, suddenly exposed. 17 patients. One of them her former commander. One of them someone's father. Muscle memory took over. She waded deeper into the dark, her legs moving through resistance that grew stronger with each step, her light finding the outlines of the surgical ward's double doors. The water rose as she moved. Knee-deep. Mid-thigh. The cold burned like fire, but pain was information, and information was what kept people alive. She had no idea what was waiting on the other side of those doors. She had no idea that this moment, this choice to descend into darkness instead of obey, would become the fulcrum on which everything else would turn. The basement door burst open and Sarah stepped into darkness that swallowed sound. Water roared like something alive, churning through corridors that had been sterile and ordered 12 hours ago. Now they were a rapids. Chest deep. Rising. The emergency lighting system had shorted at 11:13 p.m. when the backup generators flooded, leaving only the lead strips on the crash carts casting ghosts of light across the black water. 17 patients. Lower surgical wing. Trapped. Upstairs, Dr. Ashford had repositioned himself to the administrative wing on the 3rd floor, his voice steady as he made calls to board members at midnight, necessary triage decisions, he'd said, his hand covering the phone receiver as he reassigned the last 3 floor nurses to upper floors. Liability containment. Risk management. The language of someone who understood institutional power the way other men understood breathing. He had not followed Sarah downward. He had not even considered it. Sarah did not think about this. She moved into the water. The current hit her thighs, then her waist, then climbed toward her ribs. The water was cold, early October, but the basement stayed cool year-round, and the flooding had come from upstream, from the dam failure 3 miles north that nobody had predicted and nobody could have stopped. She braced herself against the doorframe, one hand trailing along the wall. The tile was slick. Her other hand held a trauma-light clip to her scrub pocket, its beam cutting a thin line through the dark. 20 feet down the corridor. Room for 07 first. The water here had turned the diagnostic equipment into obstacles. She heard voices before she saw them, panic in pitched frequencies that water carries differently than air. A man's voice, sharp with fear. A woman's voice trying to be steady and failing. Sarah pushed through the water toward the sound. Room for 07 held a post-op patient, 73-year-old male, post-appendectomy 6 hours ago, still on continuous monitoring. The man and woman were his son and daughter-in-law, both in street clothes that were now soaked, both trying to hold the 4-pole above the rising water while the patient sat on the bed, still groggy from anesthesia, not understanding the danger. Sarah's voice when she spoke was not the voice that had accepted Ashford's humiliations 2 days ago. It was different, lower register, clipped. Military bearing returned like a uniform being pulled on. Support the 4-pole. Keep it above his head. Count 3 steps before you move. The woman looked at her. Saw the authority in her posture, the absolute certainty in her stance, and something in her face shifted from panic to compliance. Sarah positioned the patient's arm around her shoulder and the son's shoulder, her hands already calculating weight distribution, current resistance, the distance to the stairwell. Move. Now. They moved. She got them to the stairwell, handed off the patient to a waiting aide on the 2nd floor landing, and turned back into the water without explanation. Room for 09. Room for 11. Room for 13. The pattern repeated, locate the trapped, assess mobility, give commands, move them upward. Her voice never wavered. Her hands never shook. She was moving through her body like a conductor moving through an orchestra she had memorized decades ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The water was rising faster now. The surge pattern had changed at 12:34 a.m. She heard the deep rumble before she felt it, a secondary surge from a backup retention area giving way upstream. The water jumped 2 feet in 2 minutes. Patients still in beds. Oxygen tanks floating like buoys. A monitor cart half submerged, its alarms still chirping uselessly, a sound like birds drowning. She was moving toward the last sector, the recovery unit, when she heard the sound that stopped her, the unique wheeze of a ventilator pushing air through fluid. Someone was still intubated. Someone was still on a machine. Someone was going to die in the next 90 seconds if that oxygen line got contaminated. Sarah pushed through the water toward the sound. The ICU recovery bay was worse than the other rooms. The lights here had survived longer, mounted higher on the walls, and they showed her everything, patient monitors going haywire, water rising past the bed rails, and there, in Bay 3, Commander James Reeves, still sedated, still intubated, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. And rising with something else. Red. His thoracotomy incision had ruptured. The surgical site, still fresh from his emergency surgery 14 hours ago, had split open under the stress and contamination. He was coding. His heart was fibrillating. The monitor showed the sine wave of a heart that had stopped trusting its own rhythm. He was drowning. Blood and water mixing in his lungs. His oxygen saturation already plummeting. 68, 62, 54. The crash cart was floating 3 feet away, its supplies scattering into the current. Sarah moved toward it with the terrifying fluid precision of something that had trained for impossible scenarios, her hands already reaching, her mind already calculating airway, breathing, circulation. ABC. But he was already intubated. The airway was secured. The breathing was mechanical. The circulation was gone. She grabbed a scalpel from the floating supplies, its blade catching the emergency light. Stainless steel. Familiar weight in her palm. She had not held one like this in 7 years. 7 years of being a night shift nurse. 7 years of burying Major. The water pulled at her ribs as she reached the bed. She positioned herself against Reeves's left side, steadied her hand against his chest, and made the incision with the kind of certainty that only comes from having done it before. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. Second intercostal space. The blade moved through skin and tissue and muscle with the authority of hands that had trained for this moment in a military hospital in Ramadi when she was someone else, when she had a name other than just a nurse. The water surged around her. She ignored it. Muscle memory was not memory at all, it was truth stored in hands. It was the body's refusal to forget. Her fingers found his heart, slick and flooding, and began the massage. Manual cardiac compression. 40 compressions a minute. She counted in her head, her jaw locked, her breath controlled even as the water tried to sweep her away from the bed. She worked. Hands inside his chest cavity, feeling the organ respond, watching his oxygen saturation climb on the monitor above, 44. 51, 58. The numbers were climbing so slowly. Too slowly. She needed 2 minutes. Maybe 3. The families. The other patients. There were 11 more people trapped somewhere in the darkness of this basement, and she was down here pressing a Navy SEAL's heart with her bare hands while her arms burned and the water rose and the thermometer in her mind kept ticking toward a limit she could not quite calculate. The sound of his heart stabilizing was not loud. Just a subtle change in the monitor's tone. A rhythm reasserting itself. Sinus rhythm. The word floated through her consciousness like prayer. Reeves gasped. Choked. Vomited salt water and blood into the endotracheal tube, and Sarah angled him, cleared the tube, reoxygenated him in the precise sequence of someone who had done this before. She didn't think about the intimacy of having her hands inside a man who had once court-martialed her. She didn't think about anything except the next task. The next patient. The next breath. She closed the incision with sutures from a trauma kit, her hands moving with such efficiency that anyone watching would have seen not a nurse but something older, something trained. She secured him to a floating gurney, tied him down with sterile cloth strips, and pushed him toward the stairwell. 23 minutes had passed since she'd entered the water. 11 more patients. 5 more hours. The water rose. The cold penetrated deeper into her core. Her scrubs clung to her like a second skin, heavy and pulling. Her hands went numb around the third hour, not from cold but from exertion. She had moved 8 patients by then, guided for families, manually freed 2 people from entangled fur lines, and resuscitated 1 post-op cardiac patient whose monitor had flatlined in the darkness. Each movement was economical. Each command was obeyed. She had become something beyond exhaustion, she had become function. By 5:27 a.m., when the water finally stopped rising and began its slow recession, Sarah stood on the second-floor landing with her scrubs torn at the shoulders, her hands raw from repeated lacerations against rough equipment, blood mixed with contaminated water coating her forearms up to her elbows. She had not cried. She had not faltered. She had moved through the basement like something that knew exactly what it was doing, and she had moved 17 people into safety. The last patient had ascended the stairwell at 5:41 a.m. The morning light was beginning to stream through the second-floor windows when she turned back toward the main corridor, intending to check the lower levels one final time, intending to confirm that no one else remained in the darkness. That was when she saw Ashford. He was standing at the junction where the hallway met the main corridor, still in his dry clothes, hair combed, expression arranged into what he probably believed was regret. Behind him stood 2 security officers. Behind them, a stack of papers on a small table, white and official against the grey tile floor. His voice, when he spoke, was modulated for professionalism. He might have been discussing a scheduling conflict or a minor equipment shortage. "Miss Chen, I need to speak with you in my office regarding your conduct during the emergency response." Sarah did not move. The water dripping from her sleeves onto the floor made a sound like a clock counting seconds. "You violated direct orders," Ashford continued, his tone gaining confidence now that she wasn't responding. "You exceeded your scope of practice. You created massive liability exposure. A nurse performing surgical procedures without authorization. The hospital cannot have that. I cannot have that. I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker." He turned slightly, gesturing to the papers on the table behind him. His expression had shifted from regret to something almost satisfied. He had been waiting for this moment. The moment when she had finally overstepped so dramatically that he could remove her without question. The moment when her invisible credentials became a liability rather than a secret asset. Sarah looked at the termination papers. She looked at Ashford's face. She felt the cold water still dripping from her hair onto her shoulders, and she thought of 17 people now on upper floors, breathing and alive because she had descended into darkness instead of obey. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply looked away and began walking toward the stairwell that led to the locker rooms, her raw hands leaving faint blood marks on the handrail. The stairwell was dark. Water still dripped from the concrete walls, the sound like a clock counting down something irreversible. Sarah moved through the basement corridor with blood on her hands and her uniform soaked through, her movements mechanical now, the adrenaline that had sustained her through 6 hours of crisis management finally burning out. Behind her, paramedics were loading the last of the 17 patients into ambulances. Commander Reeves was alive. His heart was beating because her hands had held it together when everything else had failed. She didn't let herself think about what came next. The lobby was chaos. News crews with camera lights, hospital staff standing in shocked clusters, families weeping with relief or gratitude. Ashford was already there, positioned near the main entrance where the light was best, gesturing to a reporter with the measured composure of a man who had just orchestrated a triumph. His eyes found Sarah as she emerged from the stairwell, soaking wet, looking like she'd crawled out of a grave. His expression shifted. Calculation flickered across his face. He excused himself from the camera and moved toward her with 2 security guards flanking him like remoras attached to a shark, his jaw tight, his pace deliberate. "Dr. Chen needs to come with us." His voice was low, professional, the tone of a man making a reasonable request that wasn't a request at all. He held a manila folder against his chest. "We need to discuss what happened down there." Sarah said nothing. She kept walking toward the nearest bathroom to rinse the blood from her hands, but Ashford stepped into her path, the folder now open, pages visible. Her hands went still. "Unauthorized advanced procedures," he read, his voice carrying across the lobby. Other staff had stopped moving. "Exceeding scope of practice. Performing surgical intervention without licensing. Refusing direct orders to evacuate." He turned a page. "You performed a field thoracotomy. With a scalpel from a crash cart." He paused, letting the word settle. "You understand this is a felony, don't you? Practicing medicine without a license." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Just one muscle. Nothing more." "The state board has already been contacted," Ashford continued, and now his voice had taken on that edge of satisfaction she'd heard before, that tremor of pleasure in another person's destruction. "Your nursing credentials are under formal review. I've documented every procedural violation, every moment you exceeded your authority. And frankly, Major," he said the word like it was an insult, "I cannot allow someone with your reckless disregard for protocol to continue working in this hospital." He pulled a sheaf of papers from the folder. "Termination documents." The pages were already signed. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You'll surrender your hospital badge, your access codes, and your credentials. I suggest you contact an attorney." He held the papers out. They trembled slightly in his hands, the only sign that he knew, at some level, that he was standing on ground that might not hold his weight. "I cannot in good conscience allow you to endanger another patient." Sarah took the papers. She looked at them without reading them, her eyes distant. Through the window behind Ashford, she could see the ambulance carrying Reeves pulling away, lights on, siren silent now. Alive. All of them alive. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly. She walked past him to the bathroom, where she stood at the sink and watched the pink water spiral down the drain, watched her hands slowly become pale again under the faucet. A nurse, one of the newer staff, maybe 24, had followed her in. The girl stood in the doorway, mouth open, eyes red. "That's insane," the girl whispered. "You saved those people. You saved Commander Reeves." Sarah didn't respond. She turned off the water, dried her hands with paper towels, walked out past the girl, past the clusters of staff, down to the locker room where her street clothes waited. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and resignation. She changed out of her scrub slowly, peeling away the wet fabric that clung to her skin like shed snake skin. The blue uniform felt heavier than it should. She folded it carefully, creasing the edges with the precision of someone who had once folded dress uniforms every morning for 12 years, hospital corners perfect, edges razor-sharp. It was muscle memory. It was the only thing she knew how to do perfectly. She left it on the bench and walked out. That afternoon, she returned to Sacred Heart one final time. The laundry room was in the basement, still damp and reeking of floodwater mixed with bleach. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to everything. Sarah stood at the folding table with her neatly folded scrubs, preparing to return them like a soldier returning a weapon to the armory. The fabric was still damp from the flood, but the hospital's laundry service had cleaned away the blood, the mud, the evidence. All that remained was blue cotton, now just cloth again. She began to fold them again anyway, running her fingers along the seams with exacting care. Hospital corners. Perfect edges. Crisp creases that could cut skin. It was the second time in her life she was being erased. The first time had been in Ramadi, when the mission was reclassified and her name disappeared from official records, when a court-martial had been engineered to ensure her cover would hold indefinitely. The second time was happening now, the paperwork already filed, the narrative already set, she was reckless, dangerous, a nurse who had overstepped. By next week, no one would question it. Ashford would ensure the story held. The laundry supervisor, an older woman named Rosita who'd always nodded at Sarah in the hallways, appeared in the doorway. She watched without speaking, her expression a mixture of sadness and something else, recognition, maybe, of the particular cruelty of being forced into silence twice. "He's already talking to the news," Rosita said quietly. "About how he made the tough calls during the crisis. How his leadership saved lives." Sarah didn't respond. She placed the folded scrubs on the counter, aligned them with the corner of the table the way she aligned everything in her life. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the only piece of her past she'd ever allowed herself to keep. The 3rd Battalion insignia, threadbare and brittle with age. She ran her thumb over it once, then turned away. "Take care of yourself, Major," Rosita said. Sarah stopped. She turned back, and for a moment her eyes met Rosita's, and something passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe, of what it meant to see someone and say nothing, to know someone and protect their secret. "Thank you," Sarah said. She walked out of the basement, up the stairwell, past the emergency department where nurses she'd trained with were moving through their shifts, past the ICU where Reeves was being monitored, stabilized, his chest rising and falling with lungs that worked because someone had remembered how to do combat medicine in a hospital basement. She didn't look at any of them. She walked straight through the lobby, past the reporters who were still there, past the cameras that were filming Dr. Ashford positioning himself in front of the news crew's lights, already constructing his narrative about crisis leadership and difficult decisions. She pushed through the glass doors into the afternoon, and the weight of invisible service settled over her like a familiar coat. 17 lives. 1 saved twice. And no one would ever know her name. The parking lot was empty except for the news vans. The sun was setting over Raleigh, painting the sky the color of a bruise. Sarah got in her car, an old Toyota Camry that was paid for and unremarkable, and drove away from Sacred Heart without looking in the rearview mirror. She had done this before. She could do it again. She knew how to disappear. What she didn't know was that in Ramadi, 7 years ago, a junior SEAL named James Reeves had not forgotten the major who'd saved his life the first time, the one whose name had vanished from all records but whose face he saw in his dreams. What she didn't know was that he'd spent years looking for her, tracking rumors, following classified breadcrumbs through the Navy's personnel system. What she didn't know was that waking up in Sacred Heart's ICU with his chest cracked open and his heart beating in a way that shouldn't have been possible, he'd immediately recognized the signature of her technique. And what she didn't know was that he was already making phone calls that would echo all the way up to the Pentagon. But that wasn't what was about to change everything. 2 days later, in the quiet hours of early morning, Sarah was clearing out her apartment locker, a storage unit she rented month to month, the only place she kept anything that mattered. She had her discharge papers from the Navy, folded and creased. She had her father's watch. She had the unit patch in its envelope. She was already researching new names, new cities, new hospitals where she could work under a license that didn't carry her real history. It was a routine she knew. She was folding her few civilian clothes when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Major Chen. A man's voice, military bearing, compressed into the words themselves. "This is Commander Jason Holloway, Task Force Operations. We need you to be somewhere in the next 3 hours. It's not a request. Stand by for coordinates." The line went dead. Sarah stood motionless in the storage unit, the phone still pressed to her ear. In the distance, she could hear the first hint of a sound that would soon grow louder, the familiar thud-thud-thud-thud of helicopter rotors cutting the dawn air. The thud-thud-thud-thud of the rotors grew louder, a sound Sarah Chen knew by heart, the unmistakable percussion of a Navy SEAL extraction team arriving at velocity. She stood motionless in the storage unit, hand still folded around the blue scrub she'd just removed, watching through the high window as 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended towards Sacred Heart's front lawn like judgment materializing from the morning sky. The first helicopter's skids hadn't touched asphalt when the rotor wash shattered the entrance glass, a violent crystalline explosion that sent security scrambling and triggered every alarm on the ground floor. The second bird landed 10 meters from the first, and then they came pouring out. Not medical personnel. Not administrators. A full SEAL team in tactical kit, their movement synchronized and lethal, the kind of precision that came from 1,000 operations across 1,000 kilometers of contested terrain. Boots on concrete. Weapons lowered but ready. Radios crackling with call signs and coordinates. Sarah didn't move. She'd seen this formation before, 7 years ago in Ramadi when extraction teams had come for wounded operators, but those operators had been colleagues. Those extractions had been recoveries. This felt different. This felt like retrieval. The team leader strode past security without slowing, his presence like a storm front moving across the parking lot. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of calm that only came from having already survived the worst. "We're looking for Major Chen," he said. Not a question. A command. Call sign Nightingale. She's a night shift nurse employed at this hospital. Where is she? The security guard's face went pale. The guard didn't know. Nobody in the administrative wing knew. Nobody except the people Sarah had worked with for 12 years, and she'd already stopped being visible to them the moment Ashford had signed her termination papers. But Sarah was walking toward the entrance before her conscious mind caught up with the decision. The storage unit door swung open. Her jacket was over her arm, the faded 3rd Battalion patch sewn into the lining against her heart, exactly where it had been for 7 years. The one piece of her past she'd allowed herself to keep. The only proof that Major Sarah Chen had ever existed at all. The hospital's main corridor was chaos, staff members clustering in doorways, patients craning necks from their beds to watch the military convoy deploying through their sanctuary of fluorescent light and antiseptic. The SEAL team leader saw her emerge from the back corridor and his eyes narrowed with recognition that went beyond simple identification. This was a man who read tactical situations like other people read newspapers. He saw the way she moved, the way her shoulders carried weight, the way her hands rested at her sides with a kind of readiness that took decades to ingrain. "Major Chen," he said, stepping toward her. "I go by Sarah here," she replied. Her voice was steady, different from the deferential murmur she'd used with Ashford, already shifting toward something older and harder. "I'm the night shift nurse." "Not anymore." A girl stepped forward from behind the SEAL team, 12 years old, dark hair pulled back in a braid, eyes that carried the same determined intelligence as her father's. "My dad told me to tell the Major thank you," he said. The girl's voice wavered slightly. "He said if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have a dad to come home to." Sarah felt something in her chest shift, a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying beginning to lift. But she didn't speak. She simply looked at Commander Reeves's daughter and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that belonged to a language beyond words. The administrative nurse who'd been standing nearest to the SEAL team leader stepped forward, trembling slightly. She was holding a folder, not the clinical version, but something heavier, something classified. Her voice shook as she began reading aloud to the gathering crowd. "Major Sarah Chen, United States Navy Medical Corps. Bronze Star, 2008. Bronze Star, 2010. She paused, swallowing hard. Her hands visibly trembled as she continued. "Silver Star, 2011, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Ramadi, Anbar Province. Distinguished Service Cross, 2011, for exceptional service under combat conditions. Purple Heart. Purple Heart." The nurse's voice cracked completely. The stamped red letters on each page were visible even from 10 meters away, the kind of classification that belonged in secure vaults, not in public hospital corridors. "The entire mission is redacted," the nurse whispered. "But it says here, it says 43 lives. Major Chen saved 43 lives." The SEAL team leader stepped forward, his presence commanding the space with the kind of authority that made even the hospital's chief administrator shrink backward. Major Sarah Chen served as a combat surgeon with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, from 2008 to 2011. The classified operation conducted in Ramadi resulted in 43 survivors who would otherwise have been casualties. After the mission was buried, after the decision was made to delete the operation from all official records, Major Chen was ordered into permanent cover. Into invisibility. She was discharged dishonorably on false charges and told never to speak of her service. He paused, letting that silence settle like a benediction. 2 days ago, she saved 17 more lives in a basement flooded with water, performing emergency field thoracotomy with improvised instruments while the chief of emergency medicine was on the phone discussing acceptable losses. Sarah kept her face neutral. This was what it looked like when the past became present. This was what happened when invisibility got a name. That evening, Dr. Marcus Ashford sat in a television studio chair, under bright lights and false conviction. He'd been scheduled for an interview on local news, the perfect opportunity to control the narrative. The flood had become a story about crisis leadership, about difficult decisions, about a hospital administrator who'd kept his staff safe through strategic thinking. He'd practiced his answers for 3 hours. He'd even had his suit pressed. "We made some tough calls," he said to the interview, his voice smooth and regretful and completely composed. "Emergency medicine requires triage. We prioritized the patients on upper floors who were most likely to survive, and we moved staff to ward." The studio phone rang. The producer's face went white. He spoke into his headset, then caught the interviewer's eye with an expression that said something had just fundamentally changed. "Dr. Ashford, we have a caller." Vice Admiral Richardson, Naval Special Warfare Command. Ashford's smile froze on his face. The smile of a man who'd suddenly understood that the ground beneath him had ceased to exist. The Admiral's voice came through the speakers with the kind of calm precision that only came from decades of command. "Dr. Ashford, I'm going to walk through your actions during the Sacred Heart flood event of 2 days ago. First, you ordered all medical personnel away from the lower surgical wing at 4:13 a.m. Second, at 5:12 a.m., you made a call to hospital board member Richard Sterling in which you explicitly stated the 17 patients in that sector were acceptable losses due to infrastructure failure." The Admiral paused. The silence was like concrete. Third, Major Sarah Chen, a decorated combat surgeon, went into that flooded basement anyway and saved all 17. While you were on the phone discussing liability mitigation. Ashford tried to speak. "I'm not finished," the Admiral said. The words came like strikes, methodical and precise. "Hospital security footage shows you terminating Major Chen's employment the following morning for protocol violations. Hospital records show she performed a field thoracotomy with a tactical knife while you made administrative calls. We've reviewed the video of you abandoning your post. We've reviewed the falsified reports you submitted to your board. Would you like me to describe what's in those falsified documents, or should we just release the security footage of you on the phone while Major Chen was in chest-deep water performing CPR on a Navy SEAL?" Ashford's face had transformed into something unrecognizable, a mask of sweat and panic and the dawning understanding that his entire world had inverted itself. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The camera caught every frame of it. The interview went to commercial. Within 40 minutes, the clip had been uploaded and shared across every social media platform. Within an hour, it had been viewed by 12 million people. By midnight, it was trending globally. By morning, Dr. Marcus Ashford's medical license was under suspension. By afternoon, Sacred Heart's board had terminated his employment. By the end of the week, he was facing federal investigations into fraud and patient endangerment. 6 months later, Sarah Chen walked through the parking lot of Raleigh Veterans Affairs Medical Center in her crisp white coat, Chief of Trauma Surgery embroidered on the breast in letters sharp enough to cut. She supervised a combat medicine course where young military medics learned the same techniques that had saved 43 lives in Ramadi and 17 lives in a basement that nobody was supposed to survive. As she passed the edge of the parking lot, she saw a folding table near the bus stop. A man in a polo shirt with a hospital ID badge hanging from a lanyard, outdated, expired, was sitting behind stacks of insurance brochures that nobody wanted. His hands trembled as he tried to organize them. His medical career was a cautionary tale now, a name that got used in ethics discussions as an example of what happens when profit margins matter more than patience. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Ashford looked away first. Sarah continued walking. The jacket she wore had the faded 3rd Battalion patch sewn carefully into the lining, positioned directly over her heart. For 7 years, it had been her only anchor to a past that didn't officially exist. Now, walking through the main entrance of a hospital where everyone knew exactly who Major Sarah Chen was, the patch no longer needed to hide. It could simply exist. It could simply be remembered. Commander Reeves was waiting in the lecture hall with his daughter beside him, both of them smiling. The room filled with young medics, sailors, and soldiers who'd been taught to recognize authority not by rank on a chest but by competence in the hands, by the kind of calm that only came from having held lives together when everything around them was falling apart. Sarah approached the podium and looked out at the faces turning toward her with absolute attention. These were the people who understood that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. These were the people who'd been trained by her methods, taught by her experience, saved by her invisible hands during 1,000 quiet nights when nobody was watching. She smiled, and for the first time in 7 years, it wasn't a smile designed to be invisible. It was the smile of a woman who'd been seen, and who would never hide again. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the stories of the people who save lives in the shadows. Like if you believe in recognizing quiet strength. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were?